Now, as I'm getting older and a lot closer to the end, I'm beginning to realize that this is something that not a lot of people pay a lot of attention to. And it is the attention to what happens at the end. Now, most of us don't want to think about the end because it's kind of too hard to do, right? And funny enough, because it's so hard, we think that it's not our problem to think about the end, it's someone else's problem. And as soon as it is someone else's problem, then we don't take responsibility for it. And I think basically this is what I think a lot of our problems arise from. The fact that we don't want to think about what happens at the end, and we try to make it someone else's responsibility. Now, what I found is one tool that I found useful to think about the end so that we can project backwards to where we are now, so that we can make sense of what we're supposed to be doing, is the question, and then? Because if you keep asking this question, and then, it forces us to think about what happens at the end. For instance, if you're young, and we got young guys in our team, they would say to me, I just want to make a lot of money and be really rich. My response is, and then? And they come back to me, I could buy a brand new house, I could buy new cars, I could buy a yacht, jet ski, and I'll be rich. Then I ask, and then? And that forces them to stop. And they say, well, I'll be happy then. I then ask, and then? And this is when it gets hard, right? Because they think that being happy is the end. And when I ask, and then, what is there beyond happiness? So now this is my question to you. What do you think the end is? And when you start thinking about it and you get there, and then? Now, what's all this got to do with roofing? Now, I think what the problem is in the building industry is that we don't want to take responsibility. It's always someone else's responsibility and someone else's fault, right? And what makes it worse is that we have got different trades doing different things in order to create a house. So look at the roof, for instance. We have carpenters who frame the house up. So they'll put in the house frame and they'll put in all the support structure for the roof. Then you have the guttering people who put in gutters to catch the water off the roof and drain it down into the ground. Then you got plumbers who will then do the connection work when it gets to the ground. So multiple trades have to take care of the problem of getting water off the roof, into the gutters, and then into the ground, and then away to where it's supposed to go. So let's start with the roof framer, the carpenter. He puts up the roof frame, and that will be according to best practice or to the code. There are rules and regulations about how you should put up roof framing. And the point of interest is the end of the roof. That's the edge of the roof. What happens along the edge of the roof? Because this is where you hand over the roof structure to the guttering system. Now, as an example, let's investigate valleys. We like valleys, right? Valleys and how the water from the valley goes off the roof and into the gutters. How that should be detailed, and how generally a lack of thought about what it's all for and the end becomes the source of a lot of problems that we see in the roofing game. So let's have a look at how the carpenter frames up the roof. He puts up a house frame, and when it comes to a valley, he puts in valley boards. And along the edge of the roof, the fascia goes in. And the fascia is quite important because it performs a lot of functions. Not only does it close the edge of the roof off, it provides a support for the eaves lining. And also it provides a support for the gutter. And would you believe it, it also provides the support for the roof. And if you've got a tile roof, in particular, the last row of tiles, there's this thing called the Bellcast. And this is what the Bellcast is all about. It's supposed to be a support system to ensure that the last row of tiles before the gutter is on the same slope as all the other tiles. So the difference between the last row of tiles before the gutter and all the other tiles is that there are no longer any tiles at the end, because the last tile means it's the end. There's nothing beyond that, right? So what happens if you take the tile out is that this last tile drops down. So the bell cast is to bring the tile back up to maintain the same slope all the way up the roof. And the usual way to provide the bell cast is to bring the fascia up, so that the fascia is now higher than the line of the roof battens. So you've got a bit of a kink. Now, this may be good for looks, but it brings about a series of complications. And what happens is that because you've got the fascia higher than the battens, when you put sarking in, the sarking comes down, then it curls up over the fascia. So you've got an area where water will pond on the sarking. And this is where the code stipulates that you've got to put anti-ponding beneath the last row of tiles. And the intent is that you support the sarking so that the water continues into the gutter and doesn't just sit in this trough behind the fascia. Now the problem here is that who puts in the anti-ponding? Does the carpenter put the anti-ponding in, or does the roofer put the anti-ponding in? And because there's no allocation of responsibility, the anti-ponding board never gets put in. So as a result, when you go around looking at roofs and looking at the sarking beneath the last row of tiles, you can't see any anti-ponding. And you can see a lot of instances where there's watermarks where the sarking is folded up and where there's a trough just behind the fascia. Now, another complication is where the valley comes in. Now, the valley boards are put on top of the rafters, but because of the bell cast, the fascia is lifted up, which means that the valley battens don't line up with the top of the fascia. They're actually lower than the top of the fascia. And what does this do with the valley? Well, the valley then can't continue along the same line into the gutter. It has to kink up before it goes into the gutter. And this kink point is where a lot of debris gathers, and it causes, one, a debris buildup, and two, when you have heavy rain, it forms a dam and you get overflowing of the valley because the valley is now kinked. The other thing is that because you always have leaves sitting on the kink, the bottom of the valley starts to rust. So you get premature rust at the base of the valley. That little bit at the pointy end will start rusting. So what is the solution for this problem? Well, if you go to the roof framers guidelines, somewhere in there is buried the fact that the fascia has to be cut down at the valley so that it allows the valley to go into the gutter without the kink. Now, it seems like the roof carpenter is responsible for this, but it's usually put into the too hard basket and no one ever does it. And if ever this was done and the fascia at the valley was cut down, it introduces another problem. And what is this problem? Well, what happens is that the gutter cannot be installed towards the top edge of the fascia anymore. It's got to be at a lower point, which means that the gutter all around the house is determined by the level of the valley. And a lower gutter means that higher potential of water to just shoot straight off the last row of tiles and not being caught by the gutter at all. So a lot of problems happen at the end, right? And it's not something that people think a lot about. Now, of late, I've thought a little bit about it, and there are no simple solutions. The whole thing is a trade-off, right? And because there are trade-offs, what we have to do is start thinking about what's more important. And that's where the question, and then, becomes really important, because you have to go, if I'm going to do this, and then this happens, and then, and you follow this train of thought until You hopefully get to the end, right? Once you get to the end, you ask yourself the question, is this what the end is supposed to be? Is this what it looks like? Because if you get to the end and it doesn't serve the purpose, then you've got to go back again and do something else. So it's really, really important to think about the end, because you've got to get to the end in order to figure out all the stuff you're doing now, whether it's going to give you the best result at the end. Because if you don't know what the end looks like, you're only doing things because you haven't really thought about it, and it's usually because you're told that it's done this way. And that's not thinking. Thinking means you've got to keep asking yourself, and then? Right about now, there's a question that you should be asking me. You should be saying, and then? Well, it seems like I've brought out all these problems about the end of the roof, right? So what is the solution? Now, I've got a thought experiment for you. And this solution that I propose may have a dramatic effect on how houses look in the future. Now, the basis for this thought experiment is that we do a lot of conversions from tile to colour bond. And this bloody Bellcast creates a little bit of a problem for us when we take tiles out and put a colour bond roof on. Because when we put a colour bond roof on, we put in 35mm thick battens, and when the roof sheets terminate at the end of the roof, the bloody fascia board gets in the way and it creates a kink in the roof, and the batten is now not deep enough to support the end of the roof. So we've got to bulk up the last batten so that there's support for the end of the roof. Now, this is something that a lot of people haven't thought about, because with a metal roof, you don't need a Bellcast because a roof sheet hasn't got steps in it. It's one full sheet. So if you continue the same slope all the way from the apex to the gutter, it's one single slope. So you don't need a Bellcast. Fancy that. On a metal roof, no Bellcasts. But on a tile roof, a Bellcast. So this thought experiment is, why don't we get rid of the Bellcast altogether? Since we don't need a Bellcast for metal roofs, why don't we get rid of the Bellcast altogether, and a tile roof gets no Bellcast? And as soon as we do this, what that means is that it lowers the fascia by about 25mm. And when it lowers the fascia, it means that the sarking has got a fairly uniform slope into the gutter. And that means no anti-ponding required, right? Because the water that gets on the sarking will get into the gutter. It doesn't need anti-ponding because it hasn't got a higher fascia to create that kink that the sarking has to get over. That saves a lot of problem, right? We don't have to argue about who puts in the anti-ponding board. You just get rid of the anti-ponding board. Now, what happens at the valley? Well, a similar thing will happen at the valley. Because the fascia is lower, it allows us to take the valley board all the way to the fascia and then mitre that around the fascia and have the top surface of the valley board in the same line as the top of the fascia, so that you don't create a kink in the valley. It solves that problem, right? So you don't have to cut the back of the fascia anymore. Everything seems to work. Now, what about the gutter? Well, the gutter can be installed as high up as possible if you've got an internal corner, and so the back of the gutter will be in line with the top of the fascia. So it's easy for the roof plumber. He knows that the top of the fascia can be the top of his gutter. There are no notches in the fascia to account for. You don't need to notch the back of the gutter anymore at the valleys. You just run the gutter like you would normally do with fall towards the downpipe. Simple, right? Now, if we were to do all this and get rid of the Bellcast, and then a lot of the problems get sorted out at the end of the roof. The only problem is that aesthetically, if you ever notice it, and I don't think a lot of people do, the last row of tiles is on a different angle to the rest of the roof, if you've got a tile roof. And if you have a look at this particular roof that's got no Bellcast, you'll notice that the last row of tiles is on a different angle. And if you were to drive past this house, I don't think you would notice that this roof hasn't got a bell cast. Now, if this is going to be the future of tile roofs, and then it'll simplify roof construction. If you simplify things, it makes things cheaper, and that's all we want. We want to make things efficient, and if things are efficient, it's going to cost less. So ultimately, that's the end game. So potentially, this could mean that tile roofs will end in a slightly different manner. And I think this is going to be a happier ending than the ending that we have currently at the moment.